Chronicling Folklore History. Will invite reflection and discussion amongst all of us on our meeting theme, cultural sustainability, especially in conjunction with the 125th anniversary of the founding of the American Folklore Society. This forum is sponsored by the Society of the Folklore and History section, and it will explore the effect of various media on compiling and presenting the history of folklore scholarship. The participants have produced folklore history in books, biographies, scholarly articles, university courses, institutional surveys, and academic journals, print and online. And I have taken as a frame for our discussion a quote from Henry Glassey's tradition entry in 8 Words for the Study of Expressive Culture. Henry wrote, "A better history would speak of the engagement of wills, of the interaction among traditions, each fraught with value, all striving toward their several visions of the future." And we'll consider how historiography not only reflects folklore scholarship, but serves to sustain the discipline institutionally and intellectually by chronicling the engagement of individuals, social networks, goals, outcomes, and ideas. The way we're interpreting a forum is that each presenter will take a short time to reflect on her or his engagement with folklore and history, and we're especially centering on publications surrounding the centennial in 1988 of the American Folklore Society, and so we'll look back a little bit and then forward towards what has happened since then. We invite you to consider some specific questions as you listen, and then around 11 o'clock or so, because this is a forum, we want this to be a discussion on these topics that will go till 12:15. We'll have to experiment a little about how to hear your comments. We may invite you to come forward so you can be on camera. Or if we decide that using the microphone works, then we'll need you to give us your name so that we can attribute your comments to you in the transcription. But we do want this to become a conversation. And I hope that we can work on some core questions. Why does the historiography of the discipline matter? How can change best affect the doing of folklore history, especially given changes in media? And how can folklore history best affect the future of folklore scholarship and folk life programs? Unfortunately, Rosemary Zumwalt is not able to attend. She's an emerita dean of the College of Agnes Scott College, and her husband experienced a fall, and so she is unable to be with us, but Anthony Buccitelli has her comments and will be doing a Rosemary interpretation for us. Simon Bronner is a professor of Penn State Harrisburg. He's the founding director of the Pennsylvania Culture Studies, and he's been coordinator of the American Studies program, and he is a prolific author. Ben-Amos is an emeritus professor of folklore and folk life at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been on the executive board of the American Folklore Society and associate editor and book editor of the Journal of American Folklore, and he's written some seminal works in the study of folklore. And Anthony Buccitelli is an assistant professor, yes, of American Studies at Penn State, Harrisburg, and Communications, American Studies and Communications. And he is a co-editor for Cultural Analysis. I'm going to start us off, and I have a prop. I am interested in the use of various media, maybe particularly in adaptations of fairy tales, but also I think it relates to the chronicling of American folklore history. And for me, it started with a book. This is Rosemary Zumwalt's book, American Folklore Scholarship, A Dialogue of Dissent. I found folklore studies and an honors course description for a class on the human life cycle. But what really intrigued me and made me hopeful was something I'd never seen before. The course was described as, it just had 3 words below the title, folklore. I mean, it didn't necessarily say folklore. It was about the human life cycle, but it said English and anthropology. And I'd never seen those words together. And the instructor was a visiting instructor who was a PhD candidate at Indiana University at the Folklore Institute, Pamela Blakely. And I soon learned that folklore was the field that would connect English and anthropology. And then the next year, in the spring of 1989, I found Rosemary's book. And it was a perfect tutorial for me to understand, because the dialogue of descent involved the very relations of the literary folklorists and the anthropological folklorists. I lived near the base of a mountain in Utah. It has a big block Y on it for my university, Brigham University. I took her book up to the foothills and sat there among sagebrush and grass. I think I developed my first case of hay fever from doing that. But I devoured her book, and I was so grateful to have an introduction to the people and the issues that had formed American folklore scholarship through being able to read her book. I attended an English conference where Gerald Graff presented about his book, Professing Literature, which he presented the story of English as a similar dialogue of descent between rhetoric and literary scholarship. But because of Rosemary's book, I knew that folklore belonged in that story too, and he wasn't telling it. So that became my dissertation topic, especially studying Sid Thompson's career. He combined the literary with anthropological because he worked on North American Indian tales, studying under George Lyman Kittredge at Harvard in the English department. But he was hired at Indiana University to direct their freshman composition program. So the relationship of rhetoric and literature still was going on, and folklore was a mediator. I wanted to tell the English people that story, so I turned my dissertation into an article that was published in college English, and doing a little citation study learned that very few people found it. It's rather disappointing to see that of the maybe 4 citations, 2 of them were from me referencing it in some other thing that I had written. So that discouraged me a little bit about journal articles as a medium for projecting our history to other disciplines. But when I got the opportunity to edit Folklore Historian, I learned maybe the scope doesn't reach great numbers, but I'm especially pleased that our volume for 2012 has an institutional history of the UCLA program written by Michael Owen Jones, and there still are a few back issues. If you haven't been a member of the section, you can get a back issue to see his history. So there is still a potential for journals to reach audiences, but perhaps there are some other ways that we can share folklore history, and so that's why I kind of geared this forum towards these issues. Anthony is going to present now what Rosemary would have shared with us, and then we'll hear from Simon, Dan, and then Anthony will reappear as Anthony himself. And then we'll open it up for a discussion.
Thank you. So I'm going to sort of do scene here and then become Rosemary and speak to you as her from now on here. The title of her talk here is A Personalized Voice in the History of Folklore Scholarship. I thank Jill Rudy for organizing this panel. When Jill first invited me to participate, she noted that it had been 25 years since the publication of my book, American Folklore Scholarship, A Dialogue of Descent, and 125 years since the founding of the American Folklore Society. A milestone on my path and a milestone for the Society both provide me with an opportune time for reflecting on chronicling folklore history. My particular focus, as it has developed over the years since I first began working on the history of folklore scholarship at UC Berkeley under the direction of John Holland Roll and Alan Dundas, has been on 2 interlocking streams, a combination of the institutional and individualized history of the discipline folklore. Increasingly, I have come to think of this as the personalized voice in history. As I reflect on the path I have taken in my work on the history of folklore scholarship, I recognize that I have moved back and forth from the biographical and institutional in my work on Arnold Van Gennep in 1988 and Elsie Clews Parsons in 1992, to more of a focus on the institutional and networks of affiliation with a smattering of the individual in American folklore scholarship in 1988. And in 1995 and 96, when I began my archival research on Franz Boas and his students, I shifted, without conscious thought, I will say, to a focus on what I have come to call the personalized voice in history, or the institutional and individuals and their networks of affiliation. In the past year, I have become even more immersed in the personal voice in the history of folklore scholarship in my work on Alan Dundas and his students. For this research, I consulted with, either by email or telephone, over 50 students of Alan Dundas. These interviews formed the basis for 2 articles, one of which joins with the archival work on Boas, entitled The Shaping of Intellectual Identity and Discipline Through Charismatic Leaders, Franz Boas and Alan Dundas, which is forthcoming in Western Folklore. My future biographical study on Alan Dundas, which will link the person to the discipline of folklore, indeed these two are inextricably linked, has hit a brick wall. The Alan Dundas papers, bequeathed to the Bancroft Library in 2007 by Carolyn Dundas, are housed off-site in Richmond, uncatalogued and therefore inaccessible, with no immediate or near future plans for opening the collection. I feel deeply the absence of an archival record for my work on Alan Dundas, because I know from my work on Boas the richness revealed in archives across the country. I've had the experience of reading a letter in the Boas papers in the American Philosophical Society, and then the answer to that letter in the Lowy papers and Kroeber papers in the Bancroft Library, or in the Benedict papers at Vassar College. As I became immersed in the archival correspondence, in the unpublished diaries and manuscripts of Boas and of his students and colleagues, I became palpably aware of the lives that were revealed therein. Here, in largely uncensored prose, though prose is never uncensored, were the loves, desires, dislikes, gossip, hopes, disappointments, in sum, the full range of lives lived. I was hooked, and now, as I think about it, I realize that I began reading history through those letters. Of course, one cannot read history solely through correspondence, or it would reveal a thin view of history. This must be linked to the context of the time, to the institutional developments, to the networks of communication. In my current work on Franz Boas, I endeavor always to be aware of the complexities of the times. For Boas, this means spanning 2 centuries, 2 continents, and more than 2 languages, multiple field sites, and changing intellectual orientations involving geography, cartography, ethnology, folklore, anthropology, anthropometrics, and not necessarily in that order. And myriad relationships, both professional and personal. And now for a prediction. Research on Franz Boas will in the next decade break wide open with the sweeping project undertaken by the American Philosophical Society, responsible for digitizing the Franz Boas professional correspondence, the University of Western Ontario, the home of principal investigator Regna Darnell, and the University of Nebraska Press, which will publish 17 documentary volumes of the Boas papers in both print and ebook format. With a $2.5 million grant from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the project is funded for 7 years. Each volume will have a theme and an editor with specific research expertise, quote, who will introduce, annotate, select, and transcribe the correspondence, unquote. There will be a native German language speaker to focus on the German correspondence. And for the Kwakwala materials, anthropologists Judith Berman and Aaron Glass will work jointly with representatives of the Kwakwala Council for a hybrid presentation by anthropologists and members of the First Nation. And finally, because I am in search of the personalized voice, I'll admit that I wanted to hear Franz Boas speak. And now I have a recording of him singing Sweet Rosie O'Grady, recorded in 1897 during his field work among the Thompson River Indians. And I believe Rosemary had intended to play that recording now, but I don't have it, unfortunately, to share with you. And so that actually concludes the remarks I have here for Rosemary. Thank you.
There's a handout going around because I'm going to be making a good number of bibliographic references, and I want you to be able to see what that is rather than spending time on each of the references. While it's going around, I also want to make a plug for you to stick around and continue the conversation, because after this session, the History and Folklore section will convene at the Bristol Room with Jill as editor of the Folklore Historian and myself as convener, and I invite you to that session. Exactly 40 years ago, if we're going to talk about anniversaries, Dan Ben-Amos's rabbinical article, A History of Folklore Studies, Why Do We Need It?, appeared in the Journal of the Folklore Institute with the comment that the surge of interest in the history of folklore studies during the 1960s and 70s marked a discipline as important but new. I'll be curious his reflection today, but in 1973, he proposed a function of histories of folklore studies serving to isolate folklore as an intellectual strand in the fabric of interdisciplinary scholarship. He cited Richard Dawson's insistence as the doyen of folklore studies at the time that knowing the history of folklore studies was an essential skill of folklorists worthy of the name. Many of the historiographies that I produced during the 1970s through the 1990s revolved around two centennials, the first being that of the Folklore Society of the United Kingdom in 1977, and the second of the American Folklore Society in 1987-1988. A quieter celebration, but still significant, was in 1996 for the sesquicentennial of the coining of the word folklore by W.J. Toms, particularly in the Folklore Historian and the Journal of Folklore Research. Overall, one can count in articles and books produced in the centennial era, what I call the centennial era, a notable confirmation of what Ben-Amos called a surge of history of folklore studies into a field in and of itself. And those are his words. Notable in the period after the centennials has been a shift from the historiography centered on national and thematic annals of folklore studies to biographical and institutional legacies. A number of biographical studies were produced for special journal issues devoted to fallen heroes of the discipline, such as what Rosemary discussed with Alan Dundes, also Richard Dawson, Herbert Halpert, and Wayland Hand, who in another panel some years ago I described as folklore's greatest generation because of their organization, vision, and building. Most biographies of American folklorists leave out the designation of folklorist, although they might include the keyword folklore as their study. Biographical books published by university presses on figures we think of as folklorists, such as Archie Green, Burns 2011, John Lomax, Alan Lomax, who you see there, Fanny Hardy Extorm, Vance Randolph, and Americo Paredes, made no mention of folklore or folklorist in their titles. The rise in institutional histories in the later period might be a reflection of institutions either coming of age or being threatened. Histories of degree-granting programs at Indiana University, University of Pennsylvania, Cooperstown, and UCLA appeared along with the incredible 3-volume Chronicle of the Texas Folklore Society written by Francis Abernathy. Other organizational surveys include the Hoosier Folklore Society, the New York Folklore Society, and the Children's Folklore section of the American Folklore Society. Notice for American Archives of Folklore came in book-length studies of the Hampton Institute, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, and the Western Kentucky Archives. Extensive studies of global institutions also appeared for the Israel Folktale Archives at Edith Bachai Yitzchak and Edith Pintel Ginsberg, the Reich Institute for German Volkskunde, the Irish Folklore Commission, But in Europe, national historiographies of folkloristic work were often subsumed under ethnology and ethnography, such as the study of European ethnology in Austria by folklorist James R. Dow. A notable exception, perhaps because it was generated by an American folklorist studying with Ben-Amos, is Defining the Yiddish Nation, the Jewish Folklorists of Poland by Itzik Gottesman. Impetus for oral history as a resource for historiography of folklore studies in the post-centennial period primarily came from Asia, as exemplified by Voicing Folklore, edited by M.D. Muthukam Rasamwamy. After a noble start in the 1970s at the behest of historically oriented folklorists Richard Dorson and Richard Royce, American engagement with oral history came late. The American Folklore Society, working with the Fife Folklore Archives at Utah State University, launched a digital multimedia project called Collecting Memories, Oral Histories of American Folklorists in 2011, with 6 audio interviews online and at least 1 transcript made available in the Folklore Historian, Barry Tolkien. Other folklorists who had interviews with them published outside of the Collecting Memories included Henry Glassy, Bert Wilson, and Steve Zeitlin. Not surprisingly, the size of the bookshelf and dissertation production of historiography still pale in comparison to field-based studies. Perhaps more surprising is that the number of historiographic articles and books published with folklorists in their titles during the centennial era, what I call 1972 to 1991, with 108 entries according to the MLA International Bibliography, was larger by 26% than the comparable period of 1992 to 2012. Perhaps this is attributable to the lower number of publications using historical approaches, since the keyword of history in the centennial era resulted in 332 entries, where the later period came out with 253. Total number of publications in folklore indexed by the MLA in the centennial era was significantly higher, 13,868 compared to 7,588 in the later period. A check of this trend in JSTOR under Folklore Journal reveals a similar trend. 2,167 entries with folklore in their content were listed for the centennial era and dropped to 1,800 or 17% in the later period. Titles containing folklorists had dropped from 25 in the JSTOR database. Remember, JSTOR has many fewer journals indexed than MLA, but 25 in the JSTOR database from the earlier period to 13, or a 48% drop in the later ones, and none of the later ones came out of the degree granting programs in folklore. Google's Ngram viewer shows the highest frequency of folklorists in books to be between 1980 and 1996, before steadily dropping to 2005, when it plateaued in a line to the present. The plateau in publications has to be judged relative to the growing membership in and attendance at meetings of the American Folklore Society. In other words, there are more folklorists, but fewer publications in folklore or about folklorists. No doubt contributing to the decline in the post-centennial period of doctorate granting programs in folklore, where historiographical theses and dissertations of figures identified in folklorists were primarily produced. In addition, although I'm skeptical of that figure or that thesis, and you can comment on it, because as I said, it doesn't seem like the doctorate granting programs are producing historiographies anyway. In addition, the spread of public folklore as professional locations over academic positions for folklorists in the post-centennial period probably has had an effect because of the tendency to produce discipline-based publications in academic communities. A broader question arising from the trends I've described is a representation of a post-surge 4th stage. Dan had described a 3rd stage in his typology of the important but not new stage that he borrowed from psychologist and philosopher William James. In this forum, as I move toward conclusion and looking ahead, devoted to reflection upon the 125th anniversary of the AFS with its underlying agenda of evaluating the last quarter century, of chronicling the hope of crafting a sustainable future for folklore studies, I want to intentionally be provocative with this thesis based on these statistical and bibliographic trends that you have in front of you. The status of the folklorist as a professional and the integrity of folkloristics as a discipline has been weakened because of the decline in historiographical work. Although we often look to groundbreaking field studies with attendant theories to draw attention to a scholarly pedestal for folkloristics, it is the production of historiography that drives the identity, if not sustainability, of the profession. That is not to say that folklore should drop their fieldwork and suddenly take up historiography, but the point is that the edifice of folkloristics depends on the foundation of a distinct intellectual legacy. Further, the decline of thematic and national historiography also correlates to a stigma on historical and structural approaches with the rise in the post-centennial era of a presentist post-structural paradigm. Part of what I view in the bibliography of the history of folklore studies, some of which you have in front of you, or that which can be categorized as such, is a redrawing of borders between anthropology in light of Goetzian thick description and folklore oriented toward the field at your door and community practice. One can also add a de-disciplinization of folklore in relation to literary studies, recast as narratology, usually subsuming folklore as a genre rather than method and theory within a larger entity as a discipline. In addition, emergent interdisciplinary constellations such as American studies, women's studies, performance studies, ethnic studies, and even cultural studies have displaced folklore as a location for the study of identities that formerly were not taken up by the traditional disciplines of history, sociology, literature, psychology, and anthropology. In conclusion, to address these issues, one obvious agenda is the revitalization of degree-granting programs in folklore and the academic instruction of folklore by folklorists, who presumably would encourage more folkloristic histories. This path necessitates more integration of historical and structural approaches into the purview of folklorists, however, and a commitment by those programs toward historiography. Now that what I identified as the era of communication in American folklore studies and intellectual history is transitioning apparently to a new epoch. If I was to rewrite that today, I think I would add a chapter affected by the pervasiveness of cyberculture, cultural criticism, and identity politics. Knowing the challenges of educational reorganization, I propose, in the very least, we need major disciplinary reference works, major projects that are currently lacking. One that I have proposed, and I would like to do, so I'm not just saying this would be nice and let someone else do it. A dictionary of folkloristic biography. Other disciplines have dictionaries of anthropologists and dictionaries of geographers. We do not. An encyclopedia of folklore theory and method, an international survey of national legacies. Actually, Dan may point out that Richard Dorson in 1971, I believe, put out folklore research around the world toward that end. We really do not have a follow-up to that. And a restoration of a separate bibliography of folkloristics rather than being subsumed under the MLA. The Collecting Memories project holds a great promise for the future if it results in usable products rather than archival files. In conclusion, the fourth stage might be construed as a period of revitalization in the face of challenge, as Anthony Wallace might describe the way that a culture changes itself. With more attention to historicity of its subject, it can look ahead to the discipline taking its sustainable place in a future landscape marked by profound intellectual and institutional shifts. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to surprise you with something today, now. Our concern here, as the two papers that were read before me indicate, were with the study, the history of study of folklore in academic institutions, the learned approach to folklore. I still wear the title of enemy number one of public folklore, but as an historian, I cannot ignore it. As an historian of folklore, I cannot ignore it. And obviously, as a person who is combative as I am, I take account of my enemies. So if I am looking at public folklore as enemy number one, I have to consider its place in the history of folklore in the United States, and probably this can be applicable to other countries as well. In my early approach to the history of folklore, as Simon pointed out, and he didn't go into details of this article, was influenced by anthropologists, by Peter Hallowell and Del Himes at the University of Pennsylvania. By the time that I came to the University of Pennsylvania, Peter Hallowell was still a teacher, but not as active as earlier. And he wrote a very important paper, The History of Anthropology as an Anthropological Problem. What I would like to say now is examine the history of folklore, not necessarily as a folkloristic problem, but as an anthropological problem. So looking at the map of folklore activities in the United States or in a particular country, and identify what are the cultural focus and the cultural institutions that deal with folklore in a particular country. And in the United States, I think we can look at learned societies, the establishment of the American Folklore Society, and the establishment of the American Folklore Society does not necessarily overlap the development of folklore in academic institutions. And the second place is the academic departments of folklore, and then we should look at government-sponsored folklore activities in the United States. These three prongs, directions of folklore are interrelated to each other, interact with each other, sometimes are antagonistic to each other, and at sometimes are supportive of each other. And this is the concern of the history of the discipline in a particular area, and as we are talking about now, in the United States. I think that we should not ignore any of these areas, and actually the interrelationship between them are very important. I have in my outline here dates. I don't want to overdo things and to bother your note-takings and concern with dates. We all know the date of the founding of the American Folklore Society in 1888. And we should take it into account that the motivator or the initiator of the founding of the American Folklore Society was not an academician. Newell was not did not have an academic position. He influenced, or say, called for the help of academicians, of Francis James Child, of Franz Boas, Child as a literary person, Boas as an anthropologist, and he recruited them into the establishment of the American Folklore Society, but he himself did not have an academic position. We should note that the government began to be involved in American folklore already in 1928 with the establishment by Gordon of the Division of Folk Songs in the Library of Congress. We should note also that the WPA project was a government-sponsored project, and the American Folklore Society in 1937 actually disapproved of this project, and wanted to have and insisted upon having professional folklorists be doing the recording and the collecting of folklore. And usually in the history of folklore, we vilify Dawson as a person who objected to the government to Batkin and this type of project, but it was Ruth Benedict who actually in 1937, let me see, yes, 1937 initiated the objection to the WPA project. And when Batkin was nominated as the director of the project, replacing Alan Lomax, the American Folklore Society softened its objection to the project. So I think it is necessary for us to have, I'm using an anthropological term, a holistic approach to the history of folklore in the United States. And with such an holistic approach, we are able to trace and see the development of folklore both academically, in the government, and within the American Folklore Society. Thank you.
All right, hello again. This time I'm performing as me here. As the occasion of the 125th anniversary of the American Folklore Society is a key opportunity to both reflect on the history of professional folkloristics and to rethink our priorities for future directions for the discipline, I'm extremely pleased that my colleague Jill Rudy has organized this forum, and I'm honored to have been asked to participate. First, let me say that it's my view that an effort to further chronicle the history of folkloristics must be a key piece, indeed it may be the most important piece, of any plan for developing and sustaining the discipline in the future. Since I'm aware, however, of being in a somewhat precarious position of discussing the process of chronicling folklore's history when I have only a limited contact with that history myself, I thought it might be appropriate to preface my remarks with some discussion of the events that have contributed to my firm view of the centrality of chronicling the history of folkloristics to our disciplinary identity and practice. Having initially come to folkloristics from a background in British and American philosophy, I recall being struck very quickly at the degree to which folklorists were willing to critically reflect on their own methods, theories, and disciplinary history, a procedure that, at least in my limited experience as a young student, was not prominently a concern of philosophers. While I do not recall being asked to read any intellectual or professional histories of philosophy during my undergraduate years, by the end of my first semester in the folklore program at UC Berkeley, I had read disciplinary histories of American, German, and Chinese folkloristics, as well as a sampling of classic essays from 19th and 20th century folkloristics in the United States and Europe. I had spent an entire term in Alan Dundas's Folklore Theory and Methods seminar, either presenting on or listening to members of my graduate cohort present on the history of folkloristics around the world, and I had completed an annotated bibliography of several hundred sources concerned with the history of the definition of folklore, a project that, because of the nature of Dundas's seminar, involved many hours of collaboration and discussion with my fellow grad students. I mention these experiences not just because it's pleasant to reminisce about my time at Berkeley, but also because these social experiences of chronicling folkloristic history were key moments in the development of what I might call, to use a term that folklorists have frequently borrowed from Van Wyck Brooks, a usable past of folklore, or my usable past for folkloristics. A past that, beyond its factuality, resonated with my intellectual development and orientations, and from which I could draw a sense of professional identity. The creation of this kind of usable past is especially crucial if we accept, as I came to accept after reading 2 centuries worth of failed definitional attempts, Elliot Oring's postulation that folklore may in fact be, quote, a miscellany lacking any conceptual integrity, unquote, and that it may be defined more by the interest that folklorists have in exposing the significant meaning of the seemingly trivial than by the external similarities in the material study. But if the focus should be on the interesting conversations that we as folklorists can have about otherwise disparate forms of culture, rather than on a delimited body of materials, then the development of a strong sense of disciplinary identity, underwritten by a usable history, is perhaps the most important aspect of strengthening and sustaining folkloristics. The notion of creating a usable past for folkloristics is, of course, already underway with the excellent works that have been produced, several by participants in this forum, in the last several decades. But inasmuch as a usable past must continue to meet the needs of folklorists in the future, this effort must be a continuing conversation rather than a closed question. In thinking about this issue, I began to understand more fully the import of Alan Dundas's constant efforts to assemble key historical texts in the field in his series of compilations and casebooks, most especially in his 1999 publication, International Folkloristics, which collected essays from a broad range of European and American scholars on issues of import in folkloristics. In bringing these texts, nearly all of which predated the academic institutionalization of folkloristics, and many of which were authored by writers who were not necessarily most well known as folklorists, together under the heading of classic contributions by the founders of folklore, Dundee sought to, quote, confirm the existence of international folkloristics as an independent, worldwide, and world-class academic discipline, unquote. In a sense, this was Dundee's usable history of the discipline of international folkloristics. In the same vein, we might also approach the construction of a usable past for folkloristics from the pragmatic standpoint of simply making key works of past scholarship more accessible. But we might also extend this effort to works that are currently inaccessible not just because of historical obscurity, but because of the constraints of language as well. This could not only serve to create a more broadly usable history of American folkloristics, but also to strengthen and expand the usable history of international folkloristics that Dundee's and others have sought to construct. Building on the approach that Dundee's and others have undertaken to render key texts of folklore scholarship in other languages accessible in English, we should also consider the benefits of creating a process that runs in both directions. Since we have recently seen the impact that the organized efforts of AFS can have in stimulating international cooperation among folklorists, we should consider an organized effort at the exchange of disciplinary histories. As one of the 2013 professional exchange scholars, I recently had the privilege of traveling extensively around the People's Republic of China to participate in discussions with our colleagues there. In each place we visited, I asked the scholars we met to talk about works of folklore that had been particularly important in the intellectual formation of the discipline as it exists in China. I was surprised by their responses in two respects. First, while I was familiar with some of the historical scholars mentioned as a result of my early study of the disciplinary histories of Chinese folkloristics that have been written in English, I do not recall hearing mention of any works that had been translated into English. By contrast, I was impressed at the extent to which the works of American folklore scholars had been translated into Chinese and read by Chinese scholars, though even that was somewhat limited. Dundee's extensive instruction of graduate students in the area of the history of international folkloristics and the extent to which Chinese folklorists are already reading foundational texts in American folkloristics are suggestive of how much has already been done to promote an international exchange of disciplinary histories, but more still can be done. As we are now thinking ahead to a greater sense of global engagement with the international folkloristic community, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it will be imperative that we have a formal mechanism for the exchange of historically formative texts authored in different languages. And in that respect, I would like to propose that we create a dual language venue for the translation and reprinting that mirrors works like Dundee's international folkloristics. In such a venue as I envision it, we could collaborate with our colleagues abroad to identify historically significant texts not currently available in English or in the target language, and produce a dual language volume which contains all of the texts printed in both languages. Given the specific nature of this type of volume and the constraints and costs of publication, it's perhaps most feasible to undertake this publication in digital form. And indeed, the crowdsourced translation resources available online may be a most cost-effective method of achieving dual language translation. To conclude, Valdemar Hofstein has already usefully pointed out to me that a regular international dual language journal in folkloristics may be counterproductive in as much as such a publication might sap the strength of national, regional, or local journals in other countries, and may not serve as a professionally efficacious outlet for current scholars. However, in the context of reprinting historically formative pieces to serve as the basis for the construction of an internationally usable path for folkloristics, this kind of publication could serve only to solidify folkloristics not just as a collection of national disciplines, but in Dundee's terms, as, quote, independent, worldwide, and world-class. Thank you.
Great. I think these all have given us a provocative way of thinking about these issues, and each has kind of presented a call to future action and organization. One thing that popped out that I hadn't included in any range of the questions I hope we talked about was the importance of pedagogy and the teaching of folklore history, which Anthony, I think, has demonstrated very clearly, and the others have called for or given us materials to work with. And I failed to mention that Greg Schrempf's folklore history course at Indiana was very important in my solidification of being able to do the kind of work that I did. I feel like I found Rosemary's book on my own, but I certainly needed instruction and guidance, and that course was important. So now I really hope that we can have a conversation about what you're thinking. What do you feel called to do? What has your experience with the historiography of folklore been? Have you had courses like this? Now are you wishing that you had had a course like this? Are you ready to sign up to write an entry for a biography of folklorists? We would like to hear your thoughts, and let's try. Should we try? How comfortable are you? Do you want to come up here and talk in this mic? Do you want to try? Yes? If you use the mic behind, you just simply need to remember to tell us your name, and do you want their affiliation or just their name?
Yeah, I mean, if it would be helpful for the archive for future research, since that's what we're talking about. It also saves me a lot of time.
Okay, so she's not looking it up. So you can use either one, but the idea is that we will have a conversation about these very provocative issues. And thank you to all of our presenters. Let's do that first. And thank you for being here. But now let's see where this conversation can take us. And just self-select.
My name is Barbara Klein, and I'm so sorry I had to walk you to this a little bit late, because this is, of course, extremely important. One aspect on our disciplinary history, though, that you may have addressed when I was not around, has to do with the broader perspectives. That is, I'm firmly convinced that our disciplinary history has to be studied in the light of broader developments in the human and social sciences. And not only that we make vague attempts to do so, but we are a part of this broader trajectory, and we have to be up there on the international arenas with historians working with broad perspectives, because that makes us visible. I'm thinking about a whole lot of historians, Jan Heidron and on and on. And of course we have, not to speak of all the Indian historians who are working on the broad trajectories. And we have to do our bit in that context, because that will also make us visible. I try, but we're all in our own little corners. So this is to me a very important concern, and I know it was important or is still important to Roger Abrams, for example. And then a little footnote, you may have brought it up earlier. I was thinking about our colleagues, Galita Sanders and Roquem's and Regina Bendix's companion to Folklore. I just reviewed it for the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and it has a number of features, or a lot to pick from to start to addressing the key issues, the bibliographies, and many of the things that you just brought up. Thank you.
I can just respond quickly. Again, I'm forced to refer to the maven over here, and that is the history of folklore studies. Why do we need it? Did raise a dilemma that you refer to, and that is one kind of chronicle, and partly the definition of chronicle is to be able to have an annals, to be able to have a legacy that we can see as independent, and that really was the Richard Dawson legacy with British folklorists, which I read as the model, and then Bill McNeil's dissertation was really based on that. And Dan can talk more about this, but I was more influenced at the time by what was called the new history. And Dan referred to it as folklore histories being histories of ideas rather than histories of figures, if that's a paraphrase, that's all right. And in the intellectual history, and I chose that term intellectual history rather than social or otherwise, I tried to do that within the era. And I think what has partly happened with what you're talking about is that it's more likely for folklore to be treated, or folklorists to be treated as a subject by historians rather than folklore. So Gerald Hirsch is a historian who uses folklore as part of the intellectual movements and the cultural front and so forth. So I'll stop there, but I certainly agree with you, absolutely. The folklore is part of intellectual movements of the 20th century and even more so the 21st, but it has suffered, I think, from a certain structural divide.
No. I don't have much to add. I just wanted to say that as history of ideas are not floating in the air, so they are connected to people, and therefore it's a history of ideas is also a history of folklore.
May I just add one thing on history of ideas? One of the major debates among many historians of ideas, intellectual historians, this also, is should intellectual histories of the disciplines be written by intellectual historians, or should they be written by the representatives of the disciplines themselves? To me, there is an obvious answer. There has to be some kind of cooperation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I guess. My name is Janice Greenberg. I am an upcoming folklorist. I'm just starting my studies, but I've been doing that informally for a long time. And the history of folklore and folk life has been of intrinsic importance to me. This has been a very good, very thought-provoking session. And I, as a librarian, which I am right now, I am also frustrated by what you said in your comments from Rosemary about the inaccessibility of certain archives. I am frustrated, as Simon talked about that there's no dictionary of folklorists, and I'd be really interested in getting involved in that. I'm also Anthony. When you talked about the language barrier, I've talked to several people at the conference about that, and as a jazz musicologist, I've been frustrated by seeing all these books in German, and as Dan said, it has to be holistic. And this has really, really been a great session for me, and I'm looking forward to helping. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Price. I'm a PhD candidate in the state of Harrisburg. I have a question about using historiography of folklore in other fields. The number of capital F folklore departments is certainly not expanding at the moment, much to our dismay. But that's sort of the recent trend that I see, that there's much more departmentalization towards more interdisciplinary fields such as American Studies or even history departments, English departments, things like that. So how can those interdisciplinary fields help to either propagate or use the historiography of folklore to serve their own ends? And should this be something that folklorists consider? Should we use these fields to help reestablish the place of folklore in academia? Thank you.
That is very much what I was wanting to do with my project, and thus my frustration that, I naively thought, oh, if I publish in this journal that many people should be, I assume, were reading in English studies, that would do it, and it wasn't quite enough, and thus my question about journals as a venue. But I think that my intention was correct. It just was the ability to get the reach that hasn't happened. But I have heard of other people who are teaching one of my earlier JAF articles now. And so because things are available through JSTOR in various places, we can't tell where things that we think are kind of buried may show up in the future. But that kind of suggests that still the teaching of this really matters.
When I said that there was a trend toward these interdisciplinary programs, I'm fully in agreement with what you're saying. That is where folklore right now is more likely to show up. And I did not mean that negatively, but there is a trade-off in that it seems to me that folklore is more recognizable across fields, not only because of digital communication and international travel and awareness of some of these major figures now as public intellectuals, such as Alan Dundes and Richard Dawson and so forth. But the danger is the loss of the identity of the folklorist. That in drawing an interdisciplinary picture, you're focused on the problem rather than thinking in terms of method and theory and an identification as a folklore, which suggests a disciplinary construct or at least an affiliation. Some of the answers to that is to encourage exchange, but to also note, as I was saying, what the differences are between being a folklorist and an anthropologist or a culturalist, or what it is to keep that idea of the tools of the folklorist or the perspectives of the folklorist are distinctive, even if one is doing American culture studies or ethnic studies or so forth.
Just to build off what Simon was saying just then, I think it's important to note too that the history of folkloristics is an interdisciplinary history from its beginning, right? And so in the early days of folkloristics, before sort of academic institutionalization, I mean, folklorists were housed in other fields, right? I mean, they were medieval literature scholars or anthropologists or literary scholars, in different language departments and so forth. So that's very much a part of our history, right? The interdisciplinary affiliations, right? And that's one of the things that I was sort of thinking about as Barbara was posing her question when Simon was speaking just now. could possibly provide an answer for us to the question that the historian Peter Novick posed about the value of histories of disciplines versus disciplinary histories, right? And Novick talks about histories of disciplines as the works of historians on a specific academic field, whereas disciplinary histories are produced by the people engaged in that field of research, right? And in that sense, that's one of the reasons I wanted to introduce this idea of a usable history, right? Because if what we're producing is disciplinary histories, as opposed to looking, wearing our hats as historians, perhaps, if we have those hats, and to produce a history of discipline, we're producing a disciplinary history. That is something that should be usable in terms of the way that Simon is talking about it here, in terms of creating a sense of identity that sort of is productive for us in a contemporary and a future sense as well.
I don't know whether history is a problematic science in the sense that it thrives of its goals is to find out what was the truth in a particular era. But what we are dealing with here in terms of, I don't know whether usable history or a history from who is going to write the history of folklore, I think we should realize that the history of folklore can be written by anybody who wants to write the history of folklore, but there will be different perspectives. If an anthropologist writes the history of folklore, it will not be the history of folklore that a folklorist will write. And sociologists began to write the history of folklore, it looks like folklore. They have different perspectives of what folklore is, and they examine it largely in the paradigms of popular culture. And so there may be different histories of folklore. Not all of them are usable by folklorists, but they should be interested to the folk. They should be of interest to the folklorists because they will provide us the information of how other people look at us, and this is as important as what we know is the real truth.
I also wanted to add that I think Dan has, with his 3 prongs, has given us a really important, maybe framework that the American Folklore Society was very important because it was so interdisciplinary to identify it as an intellectual endeavor, and so to remember the importance of the society, the academic programs, and then the public work that, as sometimes we talk about a crisis in the humanities, and I'm very interested in issues in public humanities, the desire to reach other audiences, and then I realized folklorists have already been there for decades because of what may seem problematic to us sometimes, but really is a great benefit to the field, that we have these 3 prongs, that we are interdisciplinary. But I also want to mention that when I joined the American Folklore Society in 1992, the field itself was going through a very weird identity crisis where the word folklore was threatened. And that was incredibly disappointing to me. I very intentionally went to the Folklore Institute. I wanted a PhD in folklore, and then to go to my first meeting and have the president questioning the very word was disconcerting, to say the least. And so I'm glad, I think we got over that. I mean, things come around again, and that may reappear, but I believe that we need to use the word folklore if we want to represent some of these distinctive features that I believe are really there. There is a truth that there is a distinctive folklore perspective, and I'm glad that we have gotten over concern with the word itself, and I hope it will last at least a couple more decades while I finish out what I am doing. But I certainly plan to do it under the name of Folklore. I had another thought, but it just went out of my head, so I will.
Well, I will just say it rears its head again and resurfaces what I'm familiar with, and maybe Barbara wants to comment as well, as a member of the Society for International Ethnology and Folklore, is that there was a proposal to drop folklore from the title. It is mostly a European-based organization, and one of the arguments was that folklore was insignificant in Europe. Although ethnologists, to what I read from that institution, do folklore. And so I did write in and I pointed out that there is this identity of folklorists that many people do claim, and why would you want to make that invisible? I don't remember a follow-up to that, but it certainly does rear its head. And when I was in the Netherlands at the Meertens Institute, they have a Department of Ethnology. They welcome me there as doing what they do. But I often would be introduced as Dr. Bronner is a professor of folklore, what we know of as ethnology. And I would roll my eyes at that, but there is some of this dialogue nonetheless that I think is still there, and we have to be aware of in relation to the rhetorical history of folklore and what we call things as well. For example, I was referring to narratology, which seemed to be growing among my literary colleagues without always footnoting folklore's contribution to the study of folk narrative.
That's it? No.
Time for us today. No, I think that many people in this audience are aware that how endangered species folklore and folkloristics are in certain parts of Europe. In my country, for example, that's a very long history. It was abolished in 1970 and kind of merged with ethnology. There are folklorists. I'm getting on. A couple of my students are here, and a few others are around. But they do not identify themselves as folklorists.
What do they call themselves?
They call themselves ethnologists, often with some effort, because ethnology is an endangered species as well. And I think where folkloristics remains the strongest as an identifiable field are in East European countries, in some of the so-called peripheries of Europe. I think folklore is a lot stronger, obviously, in China, as you said. It is a lot stronger in India than in Europe. And thank goodness CF decided to keep the word folklore, but that's because one of the folklorists is now, the folklorist that his name is the president at the moment, Vladimir Hofstein. And I think one of the antidotes is one kind of history which you didn't mention, Dan, and that would be conceptual history. And we need to put that conceptual history out there for the concept of folklore and what it does intake in an historical sense. I would also say this, as long as you can stand, it has to do with, on the governmental level, which you brought up, Dan, archives, folklore archives. Now, Sweden, where I come from, has a long history of archives. Two of the major archives are now being abolished. The one in Lund in the south, the one in Umeå in the north. Now, all the remaining archives are all sort under the Department of Education directly. They're directly governmental institutions, except for the archive at the Nordic Museum, because the Nordic Museum remains a private foundation. And this is just the beginning. And we need each other, Europeans, Asians, and Americans, to support the field and to really think of this. I'm delighted you're having this. This is obvious that you're having this discussion. But I think it's a far more endangered species than we realize.
I was thinking something more, that when we have, to add on to what she was saying about the archives, Dr. Klein, it is so important for future folklorists and people who are presently involved in folklore, and for people who we want to realize the importance of folklore, to have the words of folklorists in their own, their voice in their own words. So besides doing a dictionary of biography, to have a series of books or one encyclopedia featuring sound bites on different, or even longer, Henry Glassy or Dr. Bronner or one of the, or one of the many people, whether they're famous or more, just regional, in their own voices, talking about different things that really, their passions and that kind of thing.
Yes, and that's the oral history project sponsored by the American Folklore Society is aiming to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I do want to make a positive point. Yes, I would agree with what Barbara was saying. It's fragile, no doubt. But what maybe the dilemma that we struggle with is that there is a popular form of folklore, and I see interest in folklore rising, especially with discourse on the supernatural, discourse on mythology. In my estimation, I'm getting more requests to produce works than I ever have, more requests from the media to comment on TV shows using the supernatural and events that are occurring. And so this is what you're saying about the academic decline and where that comes from. I see some influences in the American educational system of vocationalism that is creeping in because we're not as interested in the role of the humanities as inspiration, as understanding expression. More of the students at the undergraduate level are asking, what job do you get with it? What is my training? Rather than what are my skills or what is the intellectual legacy that I'm gaining. But there is evidence all around of storytelling festivals, and it would be good for folklorists to be part of that craft. You're involved in crafts, and I see a new folk crafts revival and interest with Etsy. Any of you familiar with that? Tremendous outpouring using the word folk craft, not necessarily being reflective on what all of its meanings are, and I hope we are seen as the professional authorities to be able to comment on that, and that is where I see the challenge. And another aspect, if not in creating departments, is to creating chairs. I wrote an article on the first chair of folklore in the United States. It is not the first in the world. Of course, in Scandinavia, it was the first chair of folklore in the world, but that was in 1925, and it would have been good to follow that up. We have a Dundee's chair now, and that draws attention, especially because of the European model, that if you have a chair, this is considered important. We were talking about history tells you that it's important but not new. You have a chair and it tells you it's important academically.
Yeah, if I can actually just add on to that a little bit too. We've been stressing a lot in the early part of the forum the idea of history of folkloristics serving as something to bring together folklorists, but there's an important sense too in which history, for lack of a better word, can serve as kind of a weapon for us, a weapon to sort of communicate or establish our sort of sense of disciplinarity to the external world, right? People outside of the discipline. And sort of anecdotally speaking, I have found many times that sort of one of the most convincing things I can say to people who are not familiar with folklorists and what folklorists do to kind of demonstrate the importance of the field is to say, well, the American Folklore Society is one of the oldest professional academic societies in the United States, and it's included, Mark Twain is a founding member and former presidents and so forth. And when you sort of talk in that fashion and kind of bring the history of folkloristics into the context of American history in this case, I think it becomes a lot more, it has a lot more authority in the minds of people that are not so familiar with it.
I would like to add to that a very interesting perspective. Mark Twain was one of the founders, and this was in 1888. But the American Council of Learned Societies did not admit the American Folklore Society into its ranks until 1946. So for a long stretch of, let's say, over 50 years, the American Folklore Society, which was a home for major scholars, was not recognized as a scholarly society by the Council of Learned Societies, which was sort of the voice of the academy in general. So these nuances of history are very important for us to understand the development and the integration of folklore within the American scene in general and the American Academy in particular.
There's something about the trajectories of disciplines, and I have a little follow-up to what Simon was saying. That kind of very broad interest in all the narrative festivals on storytelling festivals, and it's going on all over, certainly the part of the world that I am well familiar with in Northern Europe. There is tremendous interest out there in the public. There is also tremendous interest among representatives for any number of disciplines, especially historians. Several historians have come up with really fine books on utilizing older folklore materials. And I'm talking about very recent books by one man called Mikael Hell and on. And they are not bad. But of course, some of us would think that in some respects, they are reinventing the wheel anew. Which is an old story. But what really puzzles me thinking about the history of folklore is how we talked ourselves up again. It's just amazing that we have managed to do so. I think our rescue is to be out there and talk about what our field actually has accomplished. Yeah.
And I see Lynn McNeil's new tiny little book, Folklore Rules. Although pedagogy really is an important part of this. And her approach is students come to folklore because they know that it's fun. And then we, because of some of our concerns about kind of an inferiority complex, we so academize it that it's not fun. She said, let's start there. Let's start with that interest and build on it. And I would add, like, ritual festival is another area of popular interest.